Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us for this conversation, Resisting Racism in Global Arts and Culture, with Dr. Mohan Ambikaipaker and Pooja Nansi. My name is Huzir Sulaiman. I am the Joint Artistic Director of Checkpoint Theatre. Since our founding in 2002, we have been focused on developing, producing, and promoting original Singapore stories for the stage and across other platforms and media. Our series of In Conversation events began with me speaking to behavioral economist Dr. Joanne Jung about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on society. And that talk is still available on Checkpoint Theatre's Facebook and YouTube channels. Today, we are delighted to convene this discussion with Mohan Ambikaipaker and Pooja Nansi on understanding racism in a global historical context and to begin to look at what role the arts and culture have in resisting racism. My co-moderator for this event is Nicole Wong. Nicole is currently an executive at Checkpoint Theatre. She completed an undergraduate degree in international relations and art history at Stanford University. She was a junior teaching fellow at the Chinese University of Hong Kong before joining Checkpoint, and she is engaged with issues of social justice for many years. Nicole.
Thank you, Huzir. And now to introduce our guests. So Dr. Mohan Ambikaipaker is a Malaysian who is Associate Professor of Critical Race Theory and Postcolonial Studies in the Department of Communication at Tulane University in New Orleans in the US. He is the author of Political Blackness in Multiracial Britain, published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018, an ethnographic study of the experiences of racialized minorities facing racism and police violence in the West. His research and teaching also engages comparative approaches in the study of race across multiple national contexts. He frequently makes international media appearances and was recently featured as a speaker in the Emmy-nominated PBS show, BLACKADEMICS, and in Astro Awani's current affairs program, Consider This.
So welcome, Mohan. Pooja Nansi is the current festival director of the Singapore Writers' Festival and is also the co-founder of Other Tongues, a literary festival of minority voices. She is the author of 2 collections of poetry. Her key performance work includes her one-woman show, You Are Here, 2016, which explores issues of migration through personal family histories. She also co-wrote and performed Thick Beats for Good Girls, which I had the privilege of dramaturging and directing for Checkpoint Theatre in 2018, which explores the intersections between feminism, identity, and hip-hop. And Pooja was a recipient of the Young Artist Award in 2016. So we're really privileged and delighted to be speaking to Mohan and Pooja today. The first part of our conversation is going to go on for, I think, about 45, 50 minutes, followed by perhaps 30 minutes of taking questions from you, the viewers. So please comment on this video with your questions, and we will answer as many as time permits.
Great. So just to start us off, I would like to add a disclaimer. So none of us here today are Black or Black American, and as such, there are some layers to these issues that we won't be able to address fully. However, we believe that these problems of racism and anti-Blackness in a global context are important issues for us to engage with. While the content of our conversation tonight may be difficult, the need for us to learn and to grow through this conversation is so important. We definitely don't have all the answers, and we may not even have all the right questions, but we are going to do our best to make sure that this discussion is as open, honest, and constructive as possible. So if you have any feedback or questions during this talk, please feel free to comment in the comment section. So to begin, Mohan, as a Malaysian academic living in New Orleans, whose personal history and studies have spanned Southeast Asia and the West, could you paint us a picture of what the situation looks like in the US and how has that galvanized your thoughts about anti-Blackness and racism?
Sure, Nicole. Thank you. Thank you to Checkpoint Theatre for hosting this event, and for Pooja for joining for the dialogue that we're going to have. I think things are going well. If you want to see it in a very positive light, we are in our 17th day, beginning the 17th day of protests, continuous, sustained, popular mobilization and protests that has revolted against a entrenched system of state violence against African Americans, a system that has not shown any willingness to reform itself or to correct its discriminatory patterns, patterns which are lethal These are questions of life and death. In total, the American police departments across the country, kill about in between 900 to 1,200 people every year. It's the most lethal police scenario on the face of the planet. Where I live, Louisiana is probably the highest, is the place on earth that has the highest incarcerated rate for African Americans, symbolized by the infamous Angola prison. And a quarter of all the people who are killed by the police, more than a quarter, a little bit more than a quarter, are African Americans. But African Americans only represent about 12% of the US population. So they're disparately impacted in the criminal justice system, not only in this issue of excessive force and the fatal use of force in policing, and over-policing, but also in the ways in which the criminal justice system has been utilized to solve long-standing historical inequities, right? So rather than addressing the long-standing racial inequities in the United States, what the United States has sort of drifted into since the civil rights era is to utilize criminalization of poor people, criminalization of Black people in particular, as, in a sense, a solution, to the problem of inequity, rather than actually going to the social roots of those inequities.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mohan. Yeah, I think in Singapore we've seen a lot of this on the news, and to hear you put this into the terms that you have, and to explain the kind of, or to describe that personal experience you've been having with it, it's been very powerful. So Pooja, from your place in Singapore, and as someone who has worked extremely hard to center the representation of and to create space for minority voices in this country, what are your thoughts on the situation at present?
I mean, I don't think that racism or how people are responding to it is something particular to 2020. As Mohan said, this has been a long, ongoing, decade, century-long struggle that's coming to light in this point of history. And I think because of the sheer amount of attention, the media attention, and the sheer amount of presence that the protesters have. Mohan, sorry, you said it was the 17th day running of protests?
Yeah, we are starting the 17th.
Yeah, and so like just that sustained energy, I think, has galvanized a global kind of conversation around anti-Blackness and racism. And in Singapore, I guess very specifically, I'm seeing the discourse happening online with a new kind of energy that I haven't seen in a while. I'm seeing new voices come into the fray. I'm seeing sort of brands and institutions attempting to speak up against it. And then that's revealing other concerns about where their stance has been and whether they're now speaking up because it's become this huge social media movement, or whether they're speaking up because that's something they've always been invested in, diversity, inclusivity, anti-racism. So I think if nothing else, this whole situation is forcing all of us to expand our understanding of racism and anti-racist practices. And I think that's the trickle-down effect that's happening in Singapore from the movement that's going on in the US. I also need to point out that Mohan is a champion because it's like 7 o'clock in the morning in New Orleans, and he looks like he's been awake for like 6 hours thinking about this stuff.
Yeah. So thank you, Pooja, for that. I think I would like to get back to that kind of how we respond right now to the fact that so many people are paying so much attention to this, but it's not a new issue, like you and Mohan have clearly pointed out. But before we get to that, Mohan, I was wondering if you could maybe unpack the term anti-Blackness for us, because we've used it a bit in this conversation so far, but I just want to make sure that we address that. So based on your study, based on your research, could you give us an idea of what anti-Blackness refers to?
Sure. I think, it's a concept that sits alongside, but is also differentiated from other terms we might be more familiar with and have used in the past, like racism, for example, discrimination, things of that nature. Racism doesn't acquire a singular form throughout history, right? Depending on its site and that specific historical context, it becomes inflected, developed, into trajectories that are quite different, even if perhaps some of the roots are similar. But this multi-sited phenomena of raciological thinking, about everything, aesthetics, beauty, economics, politics, from a racial logic premise, is something that is the inheritance of modernity, is the inheritance of colonialism. In that, anti-Blackness, though, points towards something that is embedded in all of those dynamics and perhaps, exceeds all of those dynamics as well. So anti-Blackness in particular, points towards the kind of animus that is constructed and directed towards people of Black African descent. And so much of this has to do with the history of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and how that impacted, the ideas about Blackness and Black people, not just, in the European world or in the Americas, but this is literally something that becomes internal to philosophy, internal to anthropology, internal to economics, and the rest of the world has absorbed these ideas and are themselves participants in it. For me, I just did a talk in Malaysia, talking about Malaysian anti-Blackness. Malaysians are participants, both in very direct ways vis-a-vis African presences in Malaysia, in anti-Blackness, but they have also historically been involved in engaging with the discourses of anti-Blackness, the way they see themselves racially in relation to Black African people. So anti-Blackness tries to get at that. And of course, there's also, debates and research around what are the roots of this. You can go back to not only the European slave trade, but to the previous moment of the Islamicate slave trade, to look at roots of anti-Blackness, or say in India and in the Indian traditions, to look at the ways in which, Vedic traditions themselves and scriptures encode animus against people who are darker. And this is a phenomena that, is now catching fire everywhere. I just heard of groups in Burma raising questions around anti-Blackness and treatment of people in that context. And, in many countries, people have felt the resonance because anti-Blackness is really a global structure of animus.
Great. So, what I'm hearing from you is that anti-Blackness in itself is not the product of one singular force. It's really this kind of accumulation of the ways in which we've treated the question of race and the question of Blackness over centuries, going back to colonialism, but also beyond that as well. So I'm wondering if Mohan and Pooja, if you both could speak to what anti-Blackness has looked like in Southeast Asia today.
I think there's the very obvious things that we see, like especially in South Asian communities with there's this cream called Fair and Lovely. And then there's also a cream called Fair and Handsome, so that the men aren't left out, which is its own problem of gendered beauty care that nobody needs. But, it's just, you'll see advertisement after advertisement kind of about, I remember just being like a little girl in my grandmother's house and seeing these advertisements of these like darker skinned or like dusky women who wanted to be like air stewardesses but couldn't because they had dark skin, and then they used Fair and Lovely, and 7 days later they're the correct complexion, which already, and so now like my dreams can be achieved. So like that already suggests that leaning towards whiteness equals not just beauty but also like job prospects and economic possibilities and freedom for women, which is the most ludicrous connection when you think about it. It comes down to like, if you read matrimonial ads in Indian newspapers, they talk about the complexion of like grooms and brides. And I think these things are getting hopefully more and more antiquated as people are educating themselves, but it's still very much a reality. Like colorism is something that happens in all communities. I think we've all been told like, don't play out in the sun too long, you'll become too dark, when actually if you think about it, what on earth so what will happen if I become too dark? It's not like, oh, you'll get sunburned or you'll get melanoma. It's like you'll become too dark. So I think that's like,
The other side of that is when you sort of meet up with distant relatives and they're like, in the same breath as, oh, you've lost weight. Oh, you're very fair now, huh? Oh,
yes.
Yeah, you've become very fair. It's like, I mean, I don't want to hear either, but the second is especially problematic.
The second means that I've been at home and not exercising, so I'm probably not in the best shape. But yeah, so I think like that's one very simple, real, accessible way that we can talk about how anti-Blackness manifests itself in our communities. Yeah.
For me, I think, it definitely is very resonant, like Pooja is saying, about the ways in which colorism is a kind of a associated issue to anti-Blackness. It's very much prevalent in our community. I remember as a secondary school student, being really puzzled in class when my chemistry teacher, who was Chinese, kept, I don't know, we were trying, studying the color spectrum or something like that, and then he made comments like, and this is why, Indian people cannot wear bright colors. And I was like, no, all my mom's saris are very bright. And what is he talking about? And then I asked the question and he said, oh no, that just makes people look very garish, And so I remember that being a very, profound moment where it didn't make sense to me what he was talking about, but you get a sense, of course, that this is the way people perceive you, and perceive, the ugliness or things of that nature. And, similarly, when I'm in a mixed race relationship and I have mixed race kids, which oftentimes, even in the African-American communities here or in New Orleans, the Creole communities, mean that I have actually, done something profoundly amazing in producing light-skinned mixed children, and when we went to a church here in New Orleans, people were just slapping me on the back going like, great job, you make good babies, and it's very weird. But I had the same reaction in Central Market in Malaysia when I was going out with my kids. I was engaging with this makcik, bartering about some item, and she was very kind of like gruff and hostile with me as a Malay elderly woman who was not very fair, and then my children joined me, and then she remarked, "Oh, dia macam kita." He looked like us. They look like us. Then I got a better price in my bargaining. So these are personal experiences about how certainly, we are very much engaged with, as Pooja was saying, this is not just a question of like, it is about beauty and aesthetics, but part of it is that the way raciological thinking codes these differences in phenotype, not as neutral differences, but they code it as moral differences, right? And also coded, moral differences in terms of like, what accrues to a particular phenotype, is translated to measures of intelligence or measures of, acceptability, belonging, things of that nature, and then you're treated in accordance, to that. But I also want to make a distinction between this very profound and very important dimension of racism that is present in many, many Asian contexts, right? With the very specific question of anti-Blackness, which is directed towards people of African descent. I think sometimes when we analogize, we tend to take the center of this, and it's based on the idea that, maybe this is something that is exceptionally happening in the United States. And we have our own racial dynamics, our dominant racial dynamics in Malaysia, Malay, Indian, Chinese dynamics, and the African thing is not really a big part of us. And I would say that's false, because Malaysia has a concrete presence of African people now in it. There's like over 25,000 African students studying in Malaysia. There's over 80,000 visitors that come, and also a lot of our families have become mixed, with members of the African diaspora. There's a Malaysian Nigerian writer now, Akwake Emizi, who's written an award-winning story about her experience as a Malaysian Nigerian child and the discriminations she has faced in relation to, her home, the home of her mother, who's Malaysian. And so we have actually very tangible, concrete. In my own family, I have cousins who've married, Somalians and Nigerians. And so our families, and while they may be small, but we have very tangible, concrete, face-to-face relationships with people of Black African descent. And the treatment of those people is horrible. I remember being in, a few years ago when I returned home, having tea at a very close friend's house, and the husband was a lecturer at Lim Kok Wing University, which is a university that's a very sizable African student population, and having to listen to this Indian man just excoriate his students in some of the most vulgar racist terms I've ever heard in my life, talking about, and this is what anti-Blackness is. It's a kind of animus, where the disgust, that enjoins phenotype to moral judgments, are quite virulent. And so, he was talking about how, the ugly hair of this Black woman, and how, she spoke in this like horrible way. And it was just spewing out, from him. And, he, in his example, it was explicit. These are the people who are teaching these students. Since the last week, Huzir may be aware that the situation in Lim Kok Wing University has blown up. The revelations of all the racism that the founder is engaged in, like not allowing African students to appear on stage because, he wants, blondes and blue-eyed, dancers, for some royal performance that's going to be happening. He doesn't want any Africans to be seen there. And this is a person who dubbed himself the King of Africa, put himself on a poster and a billboard, and has businesses in Lesotho. His university has branch campuses in Lesotho. So anti-Blackness, in of itself, set apart from the analogous question of colorism within our communities, very much part and parcel of our societies. And I think, it's time that we looked at it directly and dealt with it.
Can we look at the other side of it, though? I know, Mohan, in your work, you have dealt with this idea of political Blackness that extends a solidarity across other communities of color, and I think you were looking at in that book the UK context. And Pooja, I know there is a very honest and deep appreciation in your practice and in your personal development for African American culture, literature, music, and I think, can we look at the other side where, which absolutely in no way counteracts the significant evils of anti-Blackness, but is there a positive sense of a sense of a political or cultural Blackness or an emotional Blackness that extends beyond persons of African or African American descent and can be an important intellectual force, cultural force, emotional force? Pooja, would you like to speak to that?
So I would never purport to take on a Black identity, but absolutely, I think in navigating issues of my own identity, or in trying to figure out as a very young writer how to write every time I felt like an outsider, or in the music that's really taught me how to talk about my identity with any kind of authenticity. It's always been Black artists or Black thinkers or Black writers that have shone a light for me. And I do think that Black people have been, in so many ways, paving the path for the rest of us in thinking about these things, in being at the front line. So yes, absolutely, there is a solidarity there. At the same time, I will never know what it feels like to have experienced what they had to experience. But yes, absolutely. And it's because I have such gratitude for the Black thinkers and writers and artists who have taught me so much in my own practice that I think it's also my responsibility to stand alongside the Black community and also to continue doing anti-racist work in the context that I practice in and in the communities of practice that I function in.
Mohan?
From a personal, anecdotal point. I mean, the first time I ever considered this question was when I entered university in the US. And I was an undergraduate first few weeks at Swarthmore College in Philadelphia, and I was at a bus stop, and there's a group of African-American women with billboards, came up to me and they asked me, do you want to join the Black Cultural Center? And I was, taken aback, a bit surprised, and I was just like, really, can I join that? And they're like, why not? And I said, and Mao, I'm not Black. And they looked at me strangely and they said, if you're not Black, then what are you? That I've been grappling with that question for 25 years, I think, because it's more than just a question about, your ethnic background or your national background. I think it's a more profound question about, where do you identify politically, historically, in this question around, racism, and the scale of racism. This led me to, participate in the Black Cultural Center, where I learned a lot, and my inclusion, as it were, wasn't universal. Some people didn't feel that was, the right thing. Some people felt it was. I mean, we used to have, Malaysian soul food cookouts, sometimes, so we did cultural things. But just being in that environment and learning about, what my friends were going through and what their experiences were in the United States. I still remember my friends during the breaks having to take out maps and think about how to map their drive back to their hometowns so that they would avoid the racist places in between. And I never appreciated that until I myself was a target of a sort of a racial attack in a gas station in Dallas, I think. It also, being there, that was when I came across the works of a Sri Lankan Tamil British writer, a very important person in the notion of political blackness in the UK, A. Sivanandan. And it was in that library that I discovered this book called A Different Hunger that led me to understand that there was this political notion of blackness that had been developed not only in the UK, but also in reference to South Africa, in reference to the Caribbean, where people of African and Indian descent were reformulating a political identity against different kinds of politics that people had practiced in the past. So a key example of this is, for example, the distinction between people who had a Black consciousness approach in South Africa and, say, Gandhi. Gandhi was a revered figure, mythological figure for the Indian diaspora, was a very anti-Black person. I mean, his organizing in South Africa never included people of Black descent, Africans, kind of took on a special pleading case for Indians. And the basis by which he argued for Indian rights was to argue in partly that, they deserve to be treated better because they are not Africans. They're not as low and as primitive as Africans. In fact, they are far more akin to Europeans and whites because they have this wonderful, amazing culture. And so they should be, the sort of an Indo-Aryan theory. So he pleaded for racial equality based on those grounds and had very little political contact or alliances with the forces of struggle that were going on in the African communities of South Africa. It's only later, in the anti-apartheid struggle that Africans, Indians, turned away from the Gandhian strategy of, separate development or separate pleading of rights vis-a-vis the empire and joined in with the African populations. This is foretold in a very important book called The South African Gandhi by Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Vahed. But that just gives us an example that it's a complicated history, but there was also this other history of people trying to work out a different kind of politics, and I eventually participated in a group in the UK that practiced such a politics, the Neo Monitoring Project, which was a grassroots anti-racist organization in East London that helped people who had suffered from racial attacks and police abuse.
Your story about encountering and being accepted by the African American activist community in university, it's slightly, in retrospect, painful for me to hear, because I had an experience that went the other way. When I went to university in the States, I was young and I think a little immature. I was 17, my first year of university there. And so the first week you sign up for extracurricular things. So I signed up for theater because I'm a theater guy, you know, and signed up for the international students thing. And that it's in. I walk into the room and my quite shy, awkward, still quite shy and awkward, but definitely much more so at 17. That self, I was petrified because it was a room full of African American, and by the way they spoke and by their dress, they were African American and not Africans. So there's a room, and they all turned and looked at me with a not a particularly welcoming gaze. And now that I think back on it, if I were a different person, I've met so many people who are much less timid and much more open, I would have just sort of ignored that and said, oh, okay, I may have misunderstood how they're construing third world network, but let me just hang around for another 15 minutes and try and strike up a conversation and maybe forge a connection. But that young, very awkward self didn't. I just had that terrible feeling of, oh, how they're defining third world does not include me. So I left, and my friendships with people of African descent were either, you know, in the rest of my university years, were either with international students. So, you know, the guy from Ghana, the guy from Botswana, which is in South Africa, one of the little pseudo republics that apartheid South Africa set up. There was also, and then the African American friends from the theater circle that I acted with and did productions with. But there was not that sense of community that I felt like I could belong to. And so I realized since then, in the intervening years, and maybe this come up, I realized in Pooja when we were doing Thick Beats for Good Girls a few years ago, and we were looking at what does it mean for non-African Americans to be looking at hip hop, which we so love, but this is, you know, I realized there was a sense that from that initial moment of rejection, where I realized they were claiming, and entirely understandably from a political standpoint in American history, they were claiming the identity of third world for themselves, and they were excluding the guy from, you know, the Kuala Lumpur actual guy from the third world. I then began to associate African Americans with the larger cultural hegemony of America. So I accept, obviously, intellectually, the African American experience as a historically a horribly persecuted minority, from the systems of slavery through, you know, Jim Crow segregation, through the carceral state that we have now. But there's also that sense of, okay, as an actual third world, left-leaning, progressive, post-colonial person, I want to also realize that they are Americans. And I put my mind, I remember bringing this up to you, Pooja, a few years ago, when I think, okay, yes, within the American context, the African American is absolutely at a disadvantage. But imagine if you are in Afghanistan or Iraq and America has invaded your country, and at the checkpoint, in wearing the battle dress of an American soldier, happens to be a person who is African American and is pointing a gun at you, and you're a young Iraqi or Afghan boy. It becomes very, you know, you do read them as instruments of American power. And I realized that on an emotional level, there is also that sense of, okay, thinking about the American identity as in some way absolutely not equalizing, because I obviously understand the ways in which an oppressed minority is co-opted to become an instrument of American aggressive foreign policy, but it's difficult for me to overlook, and I think that's maybe something I would ask you to speak to.
Sorry, which of us would you like to address that?
All of you.
I think you alluded to our conversation and some of my feelings about it, and I think it's a complicated question you're asking, because there's like multiple layers of identities that we're confusing as well. Like there's the soldier, there's this African American person, there is us as Southeast Asians, there is the idea of like, you love hip hop, and also not all African Americans love hip hop. But it is, I mean, if you're going to talk about like that feeling of loving hip hop, but then not feeling part of the culture, for me, like a phrase I've heard recently, which absolutely makes sense for me, is that we are all guests in the house of hip hop, you know, and I really, that allows me to navigate it really well, because it's a music that stemmed from African American communities, stemmed from African American artists, and it's a protest music. And the spirit of that music is so generous that now hip hop is a global phenomena. But at the same time, it is so rooted in Black culture that you cannot, to me, it's disrespectful to love hip hop and then disrespect Black culture, you know, because we are absolutely guests in the house of hip hop. So that's to hip hop. But then I think when you brought up the idea of when you brought up the conversation about the soldier, you know, and the Iraqi boy, like in that particular moment, I think power structures are different, because this is a child that's a soldier. And when that African American man goes back to America, then there's questions of class. There's questions of who is he outside that soldier's uniform? What is his relationship to the state? Under what situations did he have to join the military? You know, there's just so much to unpack. And I think like the conversation about racism is looking at people as three-dimensional human beings. So I don't think we can see Black people as part of the hegemony of American culture, because Black individuals are so separate and so full-bodied and so three-dimensional. It would be the equivalent of, just because you appear at a festival, someone is like, Huzir is all Singapore theater, you know? So yeah, so I think it's a very complicated question and a very complicated thing to unpack. But I think maybe it lies in looking at layers of identity and layers of power in particular situations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think to build on what Pooja is saying as well, like, I think when we think about who is really controlling that story of American cultural hegemony, like it's not Black Americans who get to say what America looks like, unfortunately. Like it's usually white Americans who are determining what kind of cultural story the rest of the world gets to engage with about who the US is. Even if I think about just like what about like the films that we've kind of venerated from the US. We think about the films that won Oscars in the last few years. I think Green Book was one of them. I think The Blind Side was also, and those two movies have extremely problematic stories about that kind of white savior mentality, and has kind of relegated an African American people to a supporting role within a story that's supposed to be about them. So I think that's really important to remember. And I think it's exactly what Pooja is saying, where we kind of have to consider the multiplicity of what Americanness means. And I think the way the world interacts with that idea of Americanness, unfortunately, we are interacting with a story and a narrative that is shrouded with like white superiority, with who is in political power at the moment, with that kind of American militarism that has been so harmful to the rest of the world. And I think engaging with anti-Blackness and thinking about Black lives in the US is to really look beyond what has been exported to us through this vehicle of US cultural hegemony.
I mean, this is a question that often comes up in my classes. Other non-Black students of color oftentimes have a very anxious, nervous relationship, to African-American culture. And part of it, involves preconceptions that other non-Black people of color have in terms of, viewing African-Americans as an expectation that African-Americans are supposed to, make space when, say, these other non-Black people of color haven't had the experience of belonging in predominantly white contexts. And we want to ask, like, why is that? I mean, if you go to a Buddhist temple in San Francisco, you don't find them very welcoming of African Americans. In fact, Buddhism, and Asian religions, Hinduism, yoga, all of this kind of things have been so interested in embedding themselves in whiteness and white communities. They have not at all sought to make space, for African Americans in their midst, and oftentimes reproduce some of these anti-Black dynamics. But then, a lot of non-Black students of color expect that African Americans, when they come to university and they are finding their cohort and they're escaping from, say, predominantly white context that they grew up in, they think that Black spaces, are just waiting to absorb them, uncritically. And why should that be the case? I mean, it's not even true of their community backgrounds, and certainly, African Americans have built up spaces that are very important, and they've also had to relate in contradictory, complicated ways with other non-Black people of color. If you recall, George Floyd, killing by the police was sparked off when a store owner who was, Asian and Muslim, called the police, over the suspicion that Mr. Floyd had given him a counterfeit $20 bill. Now, the appeal to an institution in the United States that at this moment is so clearly predisposed towards, violence, lethal violence against Black people, and the kind of knee-jerk fashion in which that was done, very similar to how that woman, Amy Cooper in Central Park, understood that if you appeal to the US state, you can put Black people in danger, you can threaten Black people by calling the police on them, right? And Black people are going to be really scared, when you do this, because that's what is going on. So a lot of people have this tacit idea that they can appeal to the racism, anti-Blackness of the US state, to solve their problems or deal with their issues. And this is a $20 bill. Now the owner of that store has regretted his actions, walked back from his actions, wished he had never done it. But it also shows, for example, the complicated relationships that a lot of Asian communities, have, inside disenfranchised African-American communities, where they're store owners, gasoline, stop owners, things of that nature, and the kind of treatments that, take place in that. This, of course, was another spark around the LA riots that happened, in the early 90s in Los Angeles, also involving, a Korean store owner at that point, around that time. So, these complicated relations, which is to be expected in a kind of racialized capitalist system where people are slotted into different functions, not of their own choosing, right? But then once you're slotted in these functions, how do you then agentively behave, in these functions? If you reproduce the dynamics, like appealing to state violence to solve your issues, for you, then you participate in those discourses of anti-Blackness. And this is the unfortunate but sound basis by which, African Americans may view other non-Black people of color with suspicion or anxiety over what they are going to do, which it has been shown that people have, attempted to use the very same devices of violence against Black people that white people do. So these are the complicated ways in which, the starting point of having relationships, across the color line can be difficult. But I do not think, and certainly in my 20 plus years of working on this, I do not think your starting point is your end point. And I do not think African Americans are, in particular, so hard to get along with or so stubborn. Non-Black people of color have no problems going back to white dominant spaces that completely are dismissive of them and do not regard them, but they go back to it again and again and again and again, seeking to find validation, recognition in those spaces. But one bad experience and people are like, oh my God, Black people are so hard to deal with, we can't work with them. And why is that? So if you work, and of course understand that there is a basis for the animus, it's not personal. And you have to write new chapters in that story. And there are histories, in Malaysia, with the left, in Singapore, the great demonstrations in the middle of the century where Singaporean labor, was in solidarity with the people of Congo, and Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. Over 1,000 people gathered at Victoria Memorial Hall immediately when the Singapore trade unions demanded that they show solidarity. People like Lim Chin Siong, organized this, and then later, demonstrations in stadiums where over 12,000 people showed up. I mean, there are these other counterpoints in history that we can look out for, take up, and then develop for our own times. So the starting point is not the end point, but that is true of any kind of politics. Like if you start with any kind of politics, we know that the initial conditions are going to be very difficult, but that is not the end of the conversation or the process.
I think that is that's something that I wish my 17-year-old self had known and had heard, that the starting point is not the end point. And something you said resonated very powerfully, that there should be no expectation that Black African Americans should be immediately accommodating or welcoming of non-Black people of color. And I think there was a extraordinarily naive sense of an expectation of solidarity, especially under the idea of Third World Network, which in the intervening 30 years between 17 and 47, I've begun to realize that that's absolutely not the case. And thank you for unpacking the complexities of that for us. I think I want to turn to looking at what it means for the arts and culture to resist racism. And I would like to propose a rubric, which is my preliminary thinking on this, for the both of you and for Nicole to comment on. As someone who runs an arts organization, this is kind of how I see 7 ways in which the arts and culture community can resist racism through these 7 sites. And I'll go through them, just give you an overview, then we'll maybe unpack each one in turn with comments of all 3 of you. So 1, education, study the cultural heritage and art forms of minority ethnic groups. 2, curation, give space to minority voices and minority stories. 3, participation, remove barriers to entry for minorities in the arts. 4, representation, responsibly portray other ethnicities. 5, evaluation, make sure our idea of taste or excellence is not inherently racist. 6, amplification, to review and study minority voices. And 7, canonization, ensure minority artists can become national laureates, national treasures, taught in schools, celebrated in museums, become household names. Some of these obviously are very much the responsibility of artists and art makers, some of these are, I think, the responsibility of the media, the state, education authorities, cultural ministries in different countries. But yeah, I mean, just to look at those 7 sites, I think education, to start with that, the sense of we need to be able to appreciate the types of art that minorities make in order for us to have a kind of broadly diverse sense of human achievement. Would you have anything to add to that, or things we should be thinking about?
I mean, I think to me that the follow-up question is, what do we mean by minority art? Mm-hmm. Or does that lead us into the danger of thinking that, like, minority writers or painters make a certain kind of art that's different from majority art? And then secondly, I think, like, with my experience in the creative writing classroom, like, a lot of times, if you have teachers who aren't racially diverse, they aren't welcoming to students writing from their own lived experience. Like, I've literally had young people who've done my course and then gone on to a course with another poetry tutor who shall forever remain unnamed, and sort of texted me to say, oh, I wrote this poem that's bilingual. It's in Malay and English. And my tutor said, can I please explain all the Malay words? And so this student had to, like, write these extensive footnotes. And then the tutor was like, this doesn't work because when I read it, it ruins the flow for me. And so also, like, if educators are going into the classroom just kind of thinking the work needs to pander to them and aren't meeting the work where it is, or where its intention is, then education itself fails. So it's actually, like, for me, it's the mechanisms in the education system. Yeah.
Thank you. Mohan?
Yeah, I would like that list, and it seems great. I mean, I think that having been involved in the arts in Malaysia previously, I wrote a weekly arts review column and things like that. Of course that we are trying to create voices in our national context and things like that. But oftentimes we are referencing or in conversations with, once again, the kind of Eurocentric hegemonic ideas and patterns. And I don't have a problem with engaging with that. But even in my graduate training or my work as an academic, it is saturated. This is what substitutes for some kind of cosmopolitan knowledge. If you can quote Heidegger and Foucault repeatedly, then you are somehow legitimate in academia. But there are so many voices and so many intellectual products, aesthetic, artistic, ideas that we never engage with because they are not held up as important references in the art world, in the academic world. And I think I provided a very short list of African-American scholars that I think people should explore and read. But I think this, in addition, I would say that we should go forth to try to, create relationships, artistic relationships with people we do not usually create artistic relationships with, maybe with African Americans, maybe with Black British people, maybe with, folks from Kenya, Nigeria. Some of those books, have informed places, authors like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe. They've really played a big role in our own concepts of, what it means to be post-colonial Singaporean and Malaysian. But we have never sustained that intellectual conversation, artistic conversation, with, the continent of Africa writ large, and certainly not with African Americans, Black British thinkers, African diasporic thinkers from the Americas, for example, who have also their own experiences of post-colonialism and grappling with, the history of Western subjugation. We have not sustained and developed institutional linkages or, people-to-people linkages in very concrete ways. And I think that just being committed to make those kinds of relationships, we're committed to the relationships, and of course relationships are difficult, they're not easy. Any relationship is difficult.
Or any artistic collaboration,
yeah.
Even
and
people
so
in the same communities.
to make very concrete efforts to collaborate, exchange and engage creatively, with people who we have not actually sustained such relationships with. That is something I would just add on.
Okay.
Yeah. To add on to that, I think, and to echo some of what Pooja said before, I do think it matters a lot for us to think about who our educators are, who our curators are, who determines who gets to participate, who determines who's represented. I think even if these people who are deciding that, yes, okay, minority voices should be represented, but I think if the person doing that kind of determination is not an ethnic minority, then you do have a weird power dynamic present that I think would ultimately lead to issues being neglected or missteps being made. I also think it's really important for us to think about, with the arts and culture, like who do we see or envision as our audience? I think if artists continuously see a majority Chinese population as your audience, then in many ways the art that you create is not going to be for that diversity of perspectives that exist. And I think when I saw the term canonization, I'm also wondering if what we want to aspire to is to kind of play into existing systems of what is seen as valid or what is seen as worthy. Do we really want to judge the value or the worth of our art by what is celebrated within museums or within great big theaters? Like, is that really the measure of what it means to create art or culture that resounds with people?
That's a very important point. Like, do we decouple it from traditionally state-directed markers of worth and validity? Yeah, Pooja?
Sorry, I dropped off there for a hot minute, but I've caught up. Yeah, so I think Nicole said something I wanted to say, which was she said it much more politely than I was going to, which was F a canon. Like, I just think we need to kind of decolonize ourselves from the idea of a canon, which effectively just means some people are elevated and there's a kind of idealized reading or watching list. And I think like it would be radically cool if, especially in a space like arts and culture, we said, you know, get your inspiration from wherever, whatever cultural experiences you're growing up with whatever you're seeing around you, whatever spaces you're in, like, and all of those are valid and full of richness to explore. So I think, yeah, for me, canonization is a problematic term. And then I think to add on to what Nicole said about envisioning audiences, I guess my viewpoint is slightly different, because I think even if you visualize that it's going to be a largely majority audience, why do we assume that minority stories should not be of interest to them?
Exactly.
Yeah, and in a previous panel, I guess someone asked me kind of like, why do we think about it as majority stories versus minority stories? Like, why can't we just think of it as Singaporean stories, you know? And for me, it's like that behind that question is the assumption that there are certain stories that are more Singaporean than others. Do you know what I mean? Like, so actually any story written about Singapore or with someone who has a relationship to Singapore, for example, when I wrote You Are Here, and it was very much about my experience as a child of Gujarati immigrants, you know, and just growing up feeling kind of strange in primary school, because it was the first time I realized, like, oh, the food I'm eating at home doesn't look like the food in the canteen. To me, that's an exceptionally Singaporean story.
Yeah.
But like, you know, so, but then a lot of people will be like, oh, that's a minority story. Like, so also it's also recalibrating our brains to kind of get rid of these tick boxes and just expand our minds to be a bit more inclusive about like just how diverse we are, especially in Singapore. We are incredibly diverse, but we just don't seem to see it or acknowledge it or talk about it enough outside of state-sanctioned like CMIO terms, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an arts, as you know, running an arts organization, the sense of curation or programming that Claire and I have as artistic directors is actually looking across multiple spectrums of multiple axes of diversity, because there's gender diversity, there's amplifying the voices of the LGBTQ community, there's, you know, looking at those stories, there's looking at different types of engagement with a Singapore narrative, and there's obviously different levels, different ethnic backgrounds. Though I like you, I reject the idea of a minority story, and I think this was brought home to me when we did a reading in. We participated in the National Play Festival in Australia, and we had a group of Australian Asian minority writers come up to us, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I think the takeaway that I got was that they felt that they were being asked always to write the story about the migrant experience, whereas the full sort of spectrum of the human condition was not available to them to write about the way that a white Australian or a more recent or European immigrant would be allowed to just talk about love and family. It had to be about assimilation or discrimination or prejudice.
But I think those are also expectations from institutions sometimes.
Yes.
You know, which is we want to have a certain kind of diversity.
Which is what, you know, my point about curation is that I think those of us who like, you know, yourself running a festival, myself running a theater company, Nicole participating in those decisions about it, you know, we have to actively resist the tokenism, but actually to also acknowledge that there is a need for diversity. I just want to speak quickly to the thought about participation, and evaluation. I realize as an arts producer, downstream of the structures of training and of gateways to enter the arts, I realize there's a lot of structural work that needs to be done. And I realize a lot of it is on a socioeconomic level as well. Like, are minorities able to enter the arts? Do they have family support? Are they from a background where they are comfortable enough to deal with the uncertainty of income in an arts career? Are there scholarships available? Are they able to get trained? So, you know, when you are holding auditions and you're faced with a choice between, okay, a person from a majority who's had the training and a person from a minority who, for whatever family or historical reason, has not had the training, it's a very difficult decision. And you realize that the onus is not entirely on the arts maker or the arts practitioner. We have to go upstream to look at the structural issues and societal issues as to why we don't have equal access to that arts education or that arts training, or there's so much inequality in society that there is not that cliche of the bohemian bourgeois artist who knows that they're not going to starve. I think, you know, if that comes from people of minority ethnic groups as well, I think that's important. And finally, before we move on, I think I want to unpack the idea of evaluation. And I think that's something that I've been struggling with myself and all of us who are educators, the idea of decolonizing our own level of taste, or decolonizing what constitutes standards of excellence. And to what extent is a standard of excellence in a literary sense, in an academic intellectual sense, in a storytelling sense, is that predicated upon accepting actually historically racist, frequently Western dominated paradigms of what constitutes excellence? And that for me has been it's something that I was determined to do quite early on. From the time I started teaching playwriting at NUS in 2007, I actively resisted teaching structure. So those Western idea of the 3-act structure, which you see in every Hollywood film, is something that I found deeply problematic. And I'm trying to make myself aware of other traditions that resist the kind of rising action, the inciting incident, all of those dreadful cliches. So I think that's also important, which also affects how we look at, how we review things, how we study things, what we talk about. Like, are we saying something is bad, or are we actually secretly saying, I don't like this, I don't like and understand this culture, and I've not bothered to understand that it is good within a different cultural framework?
No, I mean, I absolutely agree. Like, I think having like come up in the poetry scene from like a slam background, you really see that happening. Like there's a real kind of privilege of the written word over the spoken word. There's a real kind of onus on publication as legitimacy. And I hear what you're saying about how it's not entirely up to the arts organizer or the practitioner, but I do also think there are certain things we can do as curators, which is sometimes to just take a chance on the untrained kid who has a lot of talent, because that person is going to have a much harder time getting access in most institutions versus the trained person. That's also like, obviously it's based on talent, like I wouldn't, and so like, I think with the festival, for example, like I tried to make space for unpublished voices, which is to say someone has done a lot of performance, or someone has done a couple of good performances, and here's a bit of a platform for you so that it boosts your visibility a little bit. And I guess I also just really was interested to talk a little bit about representation, and which was one of your tenets, and which I've been thinking a lot about, because like I think we talked in a previous panel as well about colorblind casting, which has been a real conversation in the theater scene, I know, but and how, like, I personally think we need to move away from that, because colorblind casting, I think, just disregards race, and it falls into this whole anyone can play anyone tenet. But I think bodies of color, like the difference between colorblind casting and color conscious casting, right? Which is, for me, color conscious casting says we understand the politics of bodies of color on stage, versus colorblind casting, which says we disregard race when we cast. And so I think like that's a conversation that needs to be had.
I wanted to speak to something you brought up, Huzir, which is the support given to minority artists and creators. I teach a class, a very unique class, a very precious class to me, on globalization and Malaysian film, and this is largely on the post-2000 Malaysian new wave that has been doing well in the film festival circuits, and since the advent of digital cinema, which kind of, made access to filmmaking more available. Now, even in that class, I have about 14 weeks. I struggle to find films that are not made by either Malay or Chinese directors, for example. There are very few Indian directors. Sanjay Kumar Perumal's Jagat is one film that I teach. Deepak Kumaran Menon, but his films are not available to be screened. And there's Indrani Gopal in a documentary, wonderful documentary filmmaker. So even in the Chinese, Malay, Indian kind of triangle, it's very hard to actually find Malaysian Indian filmmakers even after the sort of access of digital cinema. We have to look into why that is. Not to mention, it's very hard to find, say, filmmakers who have an Orang Asli background. To show those kinds of stories, as part of this course is a very almost impossible task. There's a documentary that I can think of, but very difficult task because they are not there, even in a medium that is supposed to be so accessible now. So these things are not just natural occurrences; they also speak to the barriers that those communities face, in being able to develop their voices, and that needs, as Pooja says, kind of color conscious strategies to overcome.
Nicole, do you have any responses to what we've talked about?
No, I think I think the distinction that Pooja mentioned about color conscious and colorblind casting is an extremely important one to remember, just because there has been a lot of people like to say that, oh, I'm colorblind, right? I don't see color. Like that has been a constant kind of defense against any kind of like racial sensitivity or any kind of attention to the distinctions of people's racial experiences. So I think even beyond the arts, it's extremely important to remember what color means in a political sense, in a social sense, what that has meant within the systems that we have allowed to continue. So yeah, I think like even though this conversation is about color consciousness in the arts, it's also really important to carry that into our daily lives as well.
Yeah, for me as a writer and a director and a producer, the matrix is very important, is the one of power and the power imbalance. And I think that applies outside of race as well. So I would say in any given situation of representation, the less powerful individual can represent a more powerful individual in that specific situation, but not the other way around. So I would say a minority ethnicity can play a majority ethnicity, but not the other way around. In most parts of the world, I would say a woman, a female performer could play a male, but I would not have it the other way around. I would say a person from the LGBTQ community could portray a straight person, but not the other way around. I think a person from a more powerful country should not be playing people from a far less powerful country. So I think that it's actually applies across a lot of different axes of power. And I think that's the important thing to respect.
No, I was just gonna say, like, based on what you were saying, like, I think it's also intersectional because I remember watching this really kind of strange but very cool production of Ibsen's Dollhouse, where all the men were played by little people, and the women were, just regular-sized human beings. And so that was incredible because the whole play is about this man trying to have power over a woman, but it was a little person on stage. And so like the men had been diminished size-wise. And that was a really incredibly strange dynamic. So, I mean, I think theater allows for a lot of very interesting, very cool possibilities. And I think bodies are instruments to portray that, And so I think as long as we are always conscious of what a body stands for and says on stage, like I think, like as you said, like it depends on the dimensions of power at play.
Can I turn to the questions from our viewers? And Nicole, can I pose the first one to you? Jillian Tan asked, how can we have a conversation about anti-Blackness with our families without them getting defensive? And I'm just wondering, as a Singapore Chinese person, and I know you've done a lot of work in thinking about these subjects and what you can do and what are the discussions that you are having with other people in your community. Could you speak to that as we begin to address the questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think discussing anti-Blackness with parents, with family is often a very uncomfortable thing for a lot of people, just because I think there is a lot to unpack there. And I think it's unfortunately, I think that people sometimes have very unproductive responses to being called racist. And I think oftentimes it's really important to kind of step back, listen to what the person is saying, and examine your own actions, as opposed to kind of policing that reaction or saying like, no, I'm not racist, like getting defensive. When it comes to speaking to parents or family members about anti-Blackness, I find that it helps to kind of to boil the issue down to what it is, which is ultimately that people's lives are at stake based on the color of their skin. And I find that in some ways taking away that academic slant from the issue helps in connecting people to really the emotional stakes, the physical stakes involved in the question of anti-Blackness. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it really depends on who you're talking to and what issues speak to them. But I do think that at the heart of it, people understand, like your parents will understand what it means to love a child. And I think that kind of instinctual love for your children is something that you can very much use in explaining why it could be so devastating for George Floyd's parents to lose him. For tons of parents of like Black American youth in the US to have to teach their child how to respond to a policeman because there will be no time for justification if somebody stops you on the road. I think those things, when you boil down to kind of that kind of very personal, very, very sad elements of what it means to be Black in the US or to be Black anywhere, I think most of the time parents, family members can understand. And that has helped me in my discussions with other people. Yeah.
I think one thing that's very true what Nicole has just said, that to begin with, you have to cut through all the layers that restrict, empathy. But scholars around racism and anti-Blackness have pointed this out, which is something that we need to also take on board, that, the scenes of subjection, to use Saidiya Hartman's term, like the scenes of suffering themselves do not move the social structures, right? In fact, we consume the suffering of Black people all the time. We get movies about it, we get songs, we relate to hip hop, and it has not helped to actually undo it. And this is a conundrum. It's not that anybody has an answer to that, but the spectacle of seeing people suffer repeatedly, which is why a lot of African Americans are expressing their utter exhaustion at this latest incident that has taken place, right? And to understand that, that empathy, while it's important, is itself, perhaps a potential, but it needs to go much further than that, because we have had the sympathies. And I have, in my own interactions, in white-dominated spaces, in academia and things like that, I've seen people who have cried in, movies, Fruitvale Station, a movie about another African-American man who was killed, and then in their actions as institutional leaders and things like that, work against the hiring of African-Americans, continue the discriminatory patterns, things of that nature. And we have to ask, how is that possible? How is the structure of anti-Blackness possible with this paradoxical thing that you can consume the suffering of Blackness in all its dimensions, and yet, be so reluctant to undo the structures that create that suffering? This is a paradox that is a part of anti-Blackness, is part of the problem of anti-Blackness. And so empathy, but it's a much harder climb.
I mean, I think it's what like Rennie Edo-Lodge says about systems of privilege, which is that people don't want to dismantle systems of privilege that they benefit from. You know, so what's in it for me if I benefit from this system of privilege? And like, I think it's exactly what you said, Mohan. Like, it's this sort of like grief porn, or like, you know, suffering porn that you go and you cry at and you feel like, oh, I'm an empathetic human being. But the work of dismantling it in your everyday life and dismantling structures and institutions and policies is a whole other kettle of fish.
So we have another question from an audience member. This is from Alfian. So because of Gandhi's view on Africans, he is aware that a statue of Gandhi was removed at the University of Ghana in 2018. There are also currently calls to remove other Gandhi statues, such as the one in Leicester, UK. At the same time, Gandhi was also an inspiration for many in the Third World who articulated forms of Afro-Asian solidarity as they underwent the process of decolonization. In addition, Martin Luther King Jr. was deeply inspired by Gandhi's nonviolent philosophy and adopted these strategies for the civil rights movement. So how do we grapple with the figure and legacy of Gandhi?
He's my people. Sorry, like he was a Gujarati man. So I have a maybe sort of, he was. So I have sort of a, and I grew up on all these stories that my dad would tell me about, like, you know, Gandhi helping people. And then obviously, as I grew a bit older, he's like, he's also deeply problematic and you need to know about that. But I think for me, like this whole thing is a larger question about like, you know, this recent kind of toppling of slave owner statues and throwing them into the ocean. And people are also talking about the Raffles statue and they're like, just throw it into the Singapore River. So I might have a slightly unpopular opinion, but I don't think we should be erasing history. Like, I feel like we need to keep those statues up and we need to kind of put another plaque there that says times have moved along and we have reevaluated this and this is additional information and here it is and you need to make up your mind. I think there's a statue at the Fremantle Harbour in Perth that does that, where one side has the original plaque and the other side has the Aboriginal perspective to the statue, you know? And so for me, it's also kind of a way of saying, we can get history wrong and people can change and people can grow instead of just kind of erasing ugly. I don't believe in erasing what was ugly. I think we need to face it. So that's how I grapple with the legacy of Gandhi, which is, yeah, he did a lot of good things, but he also did a lot of problematic things. And people are complex.
Salman Rushdie wrote an essay a long time ago when the Attenborough film on Gandhi came out about, you know, how the story of Gandhi was told in that film, you know, and why it was told in that way. I mean, and in part, research has kind of affirmed Rushdie's view that, you know, the kind of story that the story of Gandhi that has been lionized is the one that the British would like to tell, you know, which is of this non-violent person, this sort of Mahatma who stands above the field. And a lot of that has to do with the way in which he was actually very collaborative with the empire. I mean, he would often moderate the more radical expressions of protest by working class indentured laborers in South Africa. He was a great supporter of British imperialism. You know, in the Bambata rebellion that happened in South Africa, he was very much wanting to volunteer to help put down the rebellion or to serve in the ambulance corps and things of that nature. So he was very much trying to utilize empire loyalty and rest for a particular group, you know, rights within that framework. And this eventually proved to be untenable. But in a sense, because of his accommodationist tendencies, his moderating influence on more radical demands, and the British kind of, put him up as a sort of iconic figure. I think Pooja is right. I mean, we need to engage with him in all his complexities, right? I mean, he certainly has deeply problematic issues with regard of his treatment of women, and in terms of his relationship to the untouchable question, is a person who never ever wanted to abolish the basis of caste, would find many ways to provide apologetics for it, even while he was asking for temple entry and taking away barriers in the accessing wells and things like that. But he nonetheless did not want to actually undo, the Vedic ideas about caste. And there he stands very strongly in contrast to another important figure like Ambedkar, in India, who, helped to write a constitution where caste is abolished formally, but not, in practice. So, to engage with Gandhi in his complexity, we need another kind of film than the Edinburgh film. The Edinburgh film has sort of given us this sort of waxy image of Gandhi that has a lot more to do with, how the British would like to think of him than perhaps what we need in terms of grappling. But Gandhi is both perhaps the potential that we have and also all our bad flaws and all our racisms and cultural superiority, wrapped in one figure, and could be a very useful figure to study for that reason.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions here about migrant workers. So are we treating our migrant workers as modern day slaves, and are we perpetuating some version of anti-blackness in Singapore? The second question is similar. Is migrant worker marginalization a form of anti-blackness?
I mean, for sure. Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's aspects of anti-blackness. I mean, if you just look at the kind of horrible comments that come out whenever there's an article about migrant workers, and especially with this COVID kind of cluster, so many comments are based on like the color of their skin, which says something about their hygiene. And then someone was like, oh, they eat with their hands. And then I was thinking about how, like, I had just read this New York Times article about shared chopsticks, and I was thinking, like, there's no such thing as shared hand eating. So that's probably slightly more hygienic at this point. But yeah, so many comments about migrant workers are kind of rooted in anti-blackness and with the color of their skin that is assumed to be dirty. And there's this obvious kind of othering that's happening, right? Even in the messaging that we get about the COVID thing, which is like, oh, community cases are low, but the migrant worker cases are growing. And so definitely that sense that we don't see them as a part of our community. We see them as a part of this kind of invisible workforce that's building our nation. But really is kind of inconvenient for us. And like, there's all these conversations about where we're going to house them. And someone was like, create a floating station where they're literally like away from the island. So yes, I do think it's definitely perpetuating some version of or it's rooted in some kind of anti-blackness, like the sentiment towards these dark-skinned migrant workers. Yeah.
In Malaysia, we've seen, a couple of state muftis come up with the pronouncement that, the discriminatory practices by some mosques of not allowing, foreign migrants to worship is correct, because, they are vectors of disease in the COVID-19 period, and they need to be kept out. There's one thing to have it be sort of like a grassroots sentiment, but then to be amplified and supported by institutional power, state power, then kicks it up, another notch. And this is going on right now, right? So, and it contravenes everything that is, a part of the Islamic faith and doctrinally, a part of the Islamic faith. If you look at the Surah Al-Hujurat, like why God created different people, and then you have a ruling where, different people cannot come, to your mosque to pray as fellow Muslims. So the tone of this has just gotten really, acidic, and, it's very punitive. But there is that kernel where, you have to go back to how we are so absorbed in raciological thinking that we can create new kinds of racializations around, the dimensions of being a non-citizen, being a foreign worker, that it appears as a racialized entity, and it fits in with all the cultural habits we have about hierarchies and racial hierarchies and color hierarchies. It's very natural to us to do these kinds of dehumanized actions because we have been so absorbed in it, for so long. And it's also very, very efficacious. This is not a bug. To treat migrant workers, whether it's undocumented workers in the United States or migrant workers in Singapore and Malaysia, in these kind of dehumanized ways is very efficacious for our capitalist system, with the way in which we extract profits and cheap labor from these populations by denying them their full humanity, right? If you had to give them a proper accommodation, like a human being deserves, if you allow them to have families, because human beings are not just things, they're not just workers, they come with fathers, mothers, children, and why isn't that dimension of that human being, inserted in our labor regimes and MOUs? When we recruit people, we don't recruit people as human beings, we recruit people as things to be utilized for our projects, And so we are very comfortable with these kinds of servitude. We're very comfortable with treating people in a thingified kind of manner. And that is where it connects very much with the historical examples of slavery, indenture, and all these other types of modes of dehumanization that rely on turning human beings into things that we can use.
And I think it sounds like also beyond this thingification of migrant workers and this similarity that we see with anti-Blackness, there's also that element of criminalization that occurs, right? In the sense, even now with COVID-19, migrant workers have been disproportionately affected, and then now their bodies are almost seen as crimes in itself for carrying the disease, despite the fact that we as a society have created the circumstances that have allowed for this to happen. So there is that kind of criminalization that I see of migrant workers that is very similar to the criminalization you see of Black bodies in the US, in that kind of anti-Blackness in the US and other places, of course. Okay, so moving on, there's another question here about what do you think of specifically Tamil people in Southeast Asia, descendants of indentured labor and victims of genocide, using the term Black, non-capitalized?
Well, I would say first you have to study the history, to look at the places in which this has already happened. It has happened, in the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, in the political Blackness history of the UK, in the work of people like Walter Rodney and Chedi Jagan in Guyana. You have to look at these examples and also study these examples, historical precedents for its flaws and its successes. You have to critically examine. This is not something that has not happened, has already happened, and we need to look at that, those examples and to study it and think what it would even mean to have that kind of politics, in this current period. So it's not an easy question. For me, I can say that, having participated in some of the Black groups in the UK and also as a person, a non-Black person of color in the US context, participating in African-American spaces, that, the politics analysis can certainly inform us, right? But they cannot just inform us in a reified way, that they're just there to help us create our own identity of Blackness, like our brand of Blackness vis-a-vis somebody else's brand of Blackness. You cannot separate and reify it. I mean, part of creating an Indian or Tamil Blackness will have to deal with the anti-Blackness of the Indian community, if that is to be viable in any kind of form. It's not just to say, oh, we're going to address colorism in our communities and deal with that, but it's going to have to deal with the way we also treat, people of African descent.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that response. There's a question here addressed to you, Mohan, but I think Pooja, you also would have a response to this. So what are your thoughts on blackface and the removal of works like Gone with the Wind? I guess especially in line with Pooja, your thoughts earlier about preferring to kind of keep up statues of Gandhi or problematic figures, but kind of with an addendum of this is the kind of history that we've missed out.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's not just Gone with the Wind. Like I saw a Facebook post about someone being upset that Tom and Jerry now has a racist disclaimer, like about how, the character of Mammy, two feet, is that her name? The black woman who appears with just 2 feet. okay, no one here has watched Tom and Jerry, but
I've seen the old ones. It really is hilarious. As was Mickey Mouse as well.
Yeah, and they do blackface even in the cartoons, right? And so recently, I think they've put up a little disclaimer that says these views are problematic and they resemble views of a society at a time that are no longer acceptable. And someone was like, oh, you're ruining my cartoons by putting these things up. And people are very up in arms about what they're calling PC culture. And I guess my question is, like, how does like a tiny 10-second disclaimer ruin your joy of watching this cartoon? Like, what are you so upset about, really? And I think, like, in general, whenever people have a problem with PC culture, like this happens in writer circles all the time. Like, you see men bristle at like, oh, we can't write women characters now because I'm called a misogynist. And the problem is actually, sometimes I wonder if you're worried about not being allowed to write it, or you're worried about the fact that people are going to critique you for writing it badly. Because, you know, if you write it well, no one's going to have a problem. Like, I can think of many examples of men who have written female characters and done it beautifully, and no one has ever called them out. So it's just, I think it's just demanding that people have sensitivity towards their representations of the other, you know, or have sensitivity of their representations of anybody that they write or create. So with things like Gone with the Wind, like, I absolutely don't think we should be removing work. Like, I'm not for censorship, you know, I don't think we should be removing work from like our cultural history. I think Gone with the Wind shows you an antebellum South, or a representation of the antebellum South that was really, really problematic and glorified slave owners. And, you know, so I think people need to know that that was an existing kind of sentiment that is no longer acceptable. So to me, it's like, that's great. We found a great way to keep that stuff in our archive and show a kind of cultural movement, and also show growth and a change in public sentiment around it. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, you know, we have to also recognize blackface is not just an American issue, right? You know, a few years ago, there was a wonderful music video by Usher and the Malaysian artist Yuna, and it was a wonderful, tender, lovely, you know, music video. It could have been a great moment to celebrate Malaysian African-American collaboration, but it quickly disintegrated into anti-blackness. You know, when Usher, you know, committed a cultural faux pas or religious faux pas by hugging Yuna on a stage, and then, you know, a bunch of cultural creators on Astro decided to reach for blackface in order to lampoon, you know, this moment between Yuna and Usher. And so, you know, reaching for the racist tropes, reaching for, you know, the dominant, you know, mechanisms of anti-blackness in order to provide, you know, some kind of lampooning critical commentary. You know, it shows how we are so willingly predisposed, you know, to reach for these kinds of traditions, and why blackface, you know, continues to be such a nefarious kind of, you know, cultural influence and presence, because it's part of the mechanisms of dehumanizing and diminishing, you know, people of African descent. And then we wonder why we have a violent, you know, animus, you know, the way that we have, where we even conduct our critiques in this way. And of course, I think, you know, similarly, you know, there are examples in Singapore, right? Wasn't there, like, people playing Indians in Indian face and things like that has happened on, you know, Singapore's stage that has elicited, you know, critical commentary. And I think it goes back to what Huzir talked about, right? You know, in all of these examples, what you're seeing is the setting up a certain kind of power relationships and power dynamics. And there's an ideology of power being created between these constructed, you know, racial categories, you know, whenever that moment of blackface happens. So once again, it's not a power neutral thing to have blackface. It's not just like entertainment or trivia. You know, it creates a certain kind of power dynamic. I think in the light of the Black Lives Matter protests, you know, the Netherlands is beginning to walk back on its intransigence of its like Blackfeet traditions, you know, the blackface traditions, you know, in Scandinavia. It's finally beginning to even consider that it ought to take those examples critically. This is also found in the English countryside. There are citations around this in village fairs and things of that nature. So blackface actually, is an incredibly diffused type of phenomena that once again, shows how, anti-blackness is very much globally inflected.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and we've overrun slightly, but to kind of end off, maybe I could ask both of you, what are your hopes and vision for the future following this period of global attention to the issue of racism and anti-Blackness?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that's a very big question, but also while I'm really happy that it's cast attention or it's forced people to examine sort of their own attitudes and approaches, I think what I'm enjoying, maybe enjoying is a slightly nefarious word, but I am enjoying it, is I'm kind of seeing, what?
It's a problematic word, enjoying, in this context.
I am so enjoying it though, but like there's all these brands being called out instead. So like, I think because like, it just like, I don't know what it was about this particular protest, but it kind of got to a point where people were like, if I don't say something, I'm going to look like an asshole. So